To start off, I'm going to talk about the city and region that Paul was writing to in 1 Corinthians. Paul is writing to the city of Corinth, which is located in the southern part of Greece, around 50 miles from Athens. It is this narrow strip of land that separates the Peloponnese from northern Greece. Corinth was an important city in ancient Greece. It was known as a city concentrated on pleasure, materials, commercial, and more. This city is known as the center of Greek culture, so here we can find people from all parts of the world. Basically, it was known as a well-known city with diverse people. The audience that Paul is addressing in this letter is to people who were once pagans and have converted to Christianity in 56 Common Era. I believe that 1 Corinthians is one of Paul's longest letters, containing 16 chapters. He's very descriptive in this letter when addressing the subject to the people of Corinth. I think this is because there are a lot of concerns about Corinth that Paul wants to address. Paul's letter starts right away in the beginning of 1 Corinthians. The salutation is in verses 1 Corinthians chapter 1 from 1 to 3. From the salutation, we can find out who Paul is addressing his letter to. In 1 Corinthians, he addresses this letter to the church in Corinth. Next is the thanksgiving, which can be found in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 from 4 to 9. It's the usual thanksgiving which contains thanks to God for His grace, which has been given to the people through His Son, Jesus Christ. Then the body begins in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 10 to the beginning of chapter 16. In the beginning of the body, he jumps right into why he is writing this letter. He is writing this letter to solve the problems in the church. In the second chapter, he talks about the beginning of his journey with the people of Corinth when he first came to the city trembling in fear, when bringing the gospel to Corinth. But by the power of God, he was able to bring the gospel to them. This is specifically found in Corinthians chapter 2 from verse 3 to 5. In chapter 3, he begins to bring about the first concern, which is the division of the Corinthian church. There is a division in the church because people are dividing themselves according to who they believe they belong to. The people of the church are proclaiming, I belong to Paul, I belong to Cephas, I belong to Apollos, and so on. However, in chapter 3, verses 21 to 23, Paul says, So let no one boast about human leaders, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or of the world or life or death or the present or the future. All belong to you, and you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. The problem here is that the people shouldn't think that they belong to anyone except for Christ. Another issue that Paul points out is immorality, and this is found in chapters 5 to 11. The immorality issues include sexual immorality, lawsuits among believers, and issues with marriage. As he points out these immoral issues, he concludes to remind the church that Jesus died on the cross for their sins. 1 Corinthians 6:20. For you were bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body. Then from chapters 12 to 15, he clarifies the topics the church is confused about. The topics include the Lord's Supper, spiritual gifts, and the resurrection of Christ. There is a lot to take in from 1 Corinthians. So I like to think that there are 3 parts of the body in this letter. The first being the concerns about the church in Corinth, the second being clarification of the gospel, and the third being instructions on how to become one church and what it really means to be part of the church. Finally, the conclusion starts at 1 Corinthians 16:13 to the end of the book, 1 Corinthians 16:21. In the end of 1 Corinthians, he notifies the church when his next visit to Corinth will be and writes his final messages and greetings. So let's take a step back from 1 Corinthians and remind ourselves what we learned in class about Paul's letters. In class, we learned that Paul wrote letters mostly dealing with complaints and building community cohesion. 1 Corinthians is one of those letters. Paul's main purpose in writing letters was to settle quarrels among the people of Corinth, and we can find this in verse 1 Corinthians 1:11. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. Like I have mentioned in detail previously, Paul pointed out many problems that were going on in Corinth. And throughout this long letter to the people of Corinth, he points out each and every one of those problems. The concerns include division in church, sexual immorality, lawsuits among believers, marriage issues, confusion about Jesus' resurrection, the Last Supper, and more. Finally, another purpose of this letter is how he believes that the people should address these concerns to create peace in the community. This chaos is among them because the people believe that they are divided and separate people. However, they are wrong. In order to be one church, they have to work together and believe that they are one. In order to do this, Paul says that through love, it can help the members unite as one church and forget the chaos that is among them right now. He wants them to have their priorities straight, their number one priority being Jesus, and says that love is one of the components to unity in the church. 1 Corinthians 13:1-3 says, "If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." I want to emphasize that Paul says that the church is not divided and that the people are members of one church, which is said in 1 Corinthians 12:14. Indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many. There are many concerns Paul points out throughout 1 Corinthians. After pointing out the problems in Corinth, he tries to convince his audience to adopt his advice. He advises the people of Corinth that they must love each other. Without love, they are nothing. Even if they all have prophetic powers and knowledge, they are nothing without love. This advice is found in 1 Corinthians 13, but specifically 1 Corinthians 13:1-7. Through love, Paul hopes that the people of Corinth will come together as one. This is his attempt to unify the church. Along with having love, Paul advises the people to have goals to reach spiritual gifts. 1 Corinthians 14:1, "Pursue love and strive for the spiritual gifts, and especially that you may prophesy." When people concentrate on grasping spiritual gifts, then they'll be more concentrated on God than earthly things. Their concentration should go to growing a strong relationship with God, and through spiritual gifts, they will be able to strengthen their relationships. An example of a spiritual gift that Paul speaks about is the gift of speaking in tongues. When an individual has the gift to speak in tongues, no human being can understand the individual. God is the only one who can understand tongues, and therefore the individual's relationship with God would grow through this communication gift. Although tongues is one of the spiritual gifts that Paul goes into great detail about, he reminds the people that tongues is not the only gift and that in fact there are more gifts. Paul says in verse 1 Corinthians 12:4-6, "Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone." Lastly, I want to talk about Paul's words on one body with many members. One of the problems that the people of Corinth had was that the church divided themselves. They would say that they belonged to Paul, Apollos, Cephas, or Christ. To address this, Paul says that they shouldn't belong to anyone except for Christ. The church is one body, and the people in Corinth are the members that make up the church. This leads me to verse 1 Corinthians 12:14. "Indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many." And to go on into even greater detail, 1 Corinthians 12:14-27. "Indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many. On the contrary, the member of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and those members of the body that we think less honorable we clothe with greater honor, and our less respectable members are treated with greater respect, whereas our more respectable members do not need this. But God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension within the body, but the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and individually members of it." He points out that there is no greater or weaker. Instead, everyone is the same, and if one suffers, then the whole church suffers. So each member of the church should respect and help each other. The advice that Paul gives is to inform them that they need love and help one another to make up one church and to serve God. This advice was given to building unity in this community, which, like I said in the beginning of this voice thread, was the purpose of this letter. From the background knowledge that we know about Paul, like how he was an authoritative figure to Christians, I think this argument is very effective. He addressed the problems that were occurring in Corinth, letting the church know that he was hearing what was happening, clarifying the gospel to settle the disagreements in the church, and reminding them that they are not divided into parts, but instead that they make up one body. Because Paul was an authoritative figure during this time, I believe that the Church of Corinth took him seriously and took note of everything he said in his letter. I assume that the letter from Paul gave the church a peace of mind, and the chaos in Corinth must have settled a little, if not more. From this analysis, I learned that Paul's letters must have been effective during a time if he continued to write these letters to communities. I also learned that once Paul shared the gospel to a community, he continued to keep in touch through his letters, which I think is a very good idea to check up on the community just in case any issues may come up. I think the issues of Corinth that Paul points out in his letter is still relevant to modern Christianity. We learned in the beginning of this course that the Bible is comprised of ancient texts, and we can't be 100% sure that these are the actual word-for-word texts from then, because it's been changed during a great number of years. So there are still a lot of things that Christians today need more clarification on. This is one of the similar problems that modern Christianity has with Christianity in Corinth. In my opinion, I also think there is a division in church today like there was in Corinth. People choose to believe one thing over the other more. And we often forget that we are all servants of God because we are all blinded by other unimportant things. Also, as human beings, we are prone to making mistakes, and therefore the immorality that Paul mentions in Corinth, we can see in our modern society. Overall, after reflecting on Paul's letters to the Church of Corinth, our society today is much like Corinth.